Sylvia and me.
Sylvia and
Sylvia
me.
and me. Sylvia and me.
Sylvia and me.
Sylvia and me. Sylvia and me.
Hi, I'm Sylvia Beckerman, host of the podcast series Sylvia and Me, conversations with extraordinary, inspiring women.
I'm Sue Stuart-Smith. I'm a psychiatrist and a psychotherapist, and I'm the author of The Well-Gardened Mind. Welcome to Sylvia and Me.
Sue, thank you so much. And I am so happy that you could be here today.
And I'm very pleased to join you too.
So for our audience, where are you located?
I live just north of London, about 20 miles from the centre of London, in a county called Hertfordshire, in a little pocket of countryside between three towns.
Okay. And as you said, you are the author of The Well-Gardened Mind, and it's a restorative power of nature. You delve into the restorative power of gardening and nature in mental well-being. Why did you decide to write on this particular topic? I'm sure you have so much that you've experienced in being a psychotherapist and a psychiatrist. So why gardening? Why nature?
Well, it's a very good question and an important one. I mean, my professional background obviously played a part in it, but actually the earliest and biggest influence on me that inspired the book was the story of my grandfather, which I'd grown up hearing about. So he spent most of the First World War in a Turkish prisoner of war camp. And by the end of the war, when he was released and finally made it home, he was extremely malnourished, he was very traumatized, and he wasn't actually expected to live very long either. My grandmother nursed him very faithfully, helped him regain his sort of basic strength. But his trauma still stayed with him. And it was only through getting the opportunity to work on a horticultural rehabilitation project, which he did for a year, that he really recovered his health more fully and his peace of mind. And that left him with a lifelong love of gardening. He lived into his 70s. I was 12 when he died. And in particular, he cultivated orchids. He had a greenhouse, and I discovered on researching the book that the garden where he'd done this training, which really was a kind of therapy, that wasn't called therapy then, had a lot of glass houses in it, as well as vegetable beds. And I think that's where he discovered this love of growing exotic plants, because there were clearly a lot of tender plants there as well.
And so how did this affect you? And because I know you're an avid gardener, so how did this affect you?
Well, I am an avid gardener now. I have to say that story lay rather sort of dormant in my mind. I think a bit like a sort of dormant seed. I didn't really, it's one of those things, you take in these stories about your childhood or during your childhood, and then, they're just part of you. And it was only much later on that I began to reconnect with it and actually to discover gardening. So in my mid-20s, I married someone called Tom Stuart-Smith, who was just setting out as a garden designer back then. He was a very knowledgeable plantsman, and he's gone on to have a very successful career. I mean, he's a celebrated garden designer now. And we started, about 2 years after we married, we started creating a garden around what was our new home then, which was a barn in the middle of a field. It was an agricultural field, and it was quite bare and quite exposed. And we set off on this journey, kind of about making a place. And I was a complete novice. I knew nothing about gardening, so I sort of followed in his footsteps, really. And that was that, and that's where we live now. So this has been our home, a garden that's actually gone on growing. We've extended it over the last 30 years, so it's been a sort of lifelong project. But about 5 years after we began, I decided I wanted to have a little patch of my own to experiment in, and that for me was the beginning of my own personal connection with growing plants. So I set up a tiny little herb garden. I was very, very keen on cooking, and the excitement of growing all these different herbs, and particularly germinating plants from seed, hooked me into gardening. And then gradually over the years that followed, particularly as I got further in my training, was taking on greater professional responsibilities, I began to also realize that the sort of some of the simple tasks involved in gardening, particularly things like weeding or watering, you know, they can be very calming. They have a sort of meditative effect on you if you let them, if you get involved in them in that way, you know, if you don't try and rush your way through them. And I began to sort of recognize the benefit of that for myself. So all these things, I think, at different levels sort of contributed to wanting to write the book. And I think that you know, the last thing really was a sort of growing awareness in more recent years in my professional life of the kind of mounting mental health problems that we're facing, you know, that the rising levels of anxiety and depression, and that gardening could actually offer a lot of people something potentially that was missing from their lives, because we have generally become so disconnected from nature.
Yes, we have. And as you and I talked before, you did the research on this book prior to the pandemic. And we are in a pandemic situation right now. It just so happens that you and I are talking, we're taping this in the summer, but we're also going to be going into the fall, which I do want to get into in just a little bit. But for right now, I'd like to, if you could, what kind of research did you do? What were you looking at to see how planting a garden and watching it grow, whether it be flowers, plants, whether it be vegetables and herbs, how did you go about doing this, and what exactly were you looking for?
I don't know that I was looking for anything, because I set off in a very kind of exploratory way. I actually started writing the book and researching it about more than 5 years ago. So it's been a long time in the making. And I traveled to quite a lot of projects in different countries, actually, different projects that specialized in different aspects of therapeutic gardening, whether that be mental health projects, prisons, addiction projects, projects for at-risk youth, projects helping people who are suffering from depression and anxiety, as well as older people. So I covered a lot of ground, actually. And one of the reasons I wanted to do that was because when I looked at many of the things that have been written about gardening, I found that sometimes it just felt a bit like, you know, to say, we can say things like gardening gives people hope, but I wanted to understand how it gives people hope, what it is that actually does that. So I wanted to explore and hear from people how it had helped them in a personal way.
Okay.
And it was a very, very moving at times, and an enlightening process. I learned a huge amount, and some of the people I interviewed feature in the book. But I suppose every project I visited, every person I interviewed also kind of fed into it.
Well, one of the things that you discovered was the socioeconomic inequalities. Can you tell us, I know that you went into prisons, you went into, as you said, you went into inner cities. So why don't you give us a couple of examples? I know you did, I was going to say you did a stint at Rikers. No, you did a research project at Rikers Island, one of the very well-known prisons in New York. What did you find out there?
Yes, visiting Rikers was really fascinating, actually. And I think well, I learned many things from that visit, but what was most striking was the power of gardening to help people who feel very lost in life, and who've never had any form of success or encouragement, and who've perhaps despaired actually of being able to do anything worthwhile or being able to change their lives. So, for example, one of the prisoners I interviewed had been in and out of jail many times, but this was the first time that he'd enrolled on the horticulture program there, which is run by the Hort, the New York Society for Horticulture. And for him, the business of harvesting the squash plants that he had helped grow was so it gave him such a sense of achievement, actually, this simple thing, really. And he'd been able to, it was the first positive conversation he'd had with his mother on the telephone, was telling her about the squash plants. And that really gave him a bit of a sense of belief that perhaps something could change. And I think one of the things we know about for people who are in prison is that if they feel nothing is going to go right for them, and it's so difficult to make things go right for you when you do come out of prison, because people, because the label that's on you and the lack of opportunities that there are, but that actually through working with the earth, people can come to feel a bit more empowered, and as if some kind of repair in life might be possible. That I think the regenerative powers of nature are really important to us at quite a deep psychological level. They help us give belief in a future, actually, and that applies in all kinds of crisis, in all kinds of situations where people are in some kind of extremis, I think.
Well, you also went into some of the inner cities. What did you see there?
Well, one of the projects I visited was in Chicago, was a project run by the Chicago Botanic Garden for at-risk youth, and again, that these were kids who'd never had contact with the earth, and for some of them it was a very strange experience to begin with, but quite quickly, they got enormous satisfaction from working together and also eating together and sharing the produce, and generally sort of becoming much more kind of hopeful and connected, and feeling, feeling that there's a way forward. I think that's the important thing, and in a context like that, a garden creates a safe environment, which is very precious. This is the same for people suffering from trauma. A lot of the therapeutic power of a garden comes from the feeling of physical safety within it, and that in that kind of setting, people can relax their guard. On the streets, you have to be vigilant all the time in a lot of parts of a city. But within a garden, that's very different. And actually, once you enter into that kind of state, you can begin to take in new experiences. You can begin to learn. And so it helps people in so many different ways. It's not just the act of gardening. It's the whole context and the setting that you provide. And as well as the producing food, and being able to eat more healthily.
And also being able to create something and see it grow and see it flourish because of something that you've actually done, that you feel.
I think that's very, very important, that feeling of creativity, and gardening gives us a very accessible way of doing that. And people often feel, if you're a newcomer to gardening, you can feel it's a strange world of plants, and be very unsure about what you're doing and frightened of failure. but provided you start with relatively simple things, there's not a huge amount that can go wrong. And it it gives you this within months, really, within weeks sometimes. You're seeing the fruits of your efforts, and that is enormously helpful. Whether that's for anxiety, depression, trauma, feeling adrift in life. It can give. Well, I find it myself too at times. It gives you a bit of I don't know, a sort of traction on life. You sort of feel you've shaped a bit of your environment. You've contributed.
Okay, so now let's go to what we're going through right now, which we're going to be going through for quite some time.
Yeah,
we're living through a pandemic. We have no idea what the new normal is going to be, if there's a new normal. Many people are feeling traumatized, and also there are many people who cannot don't have the space to actually garden outside. What would you suggest people do? We're as I said, you and I are talking, it's summertime now, and there are still people who can't really, yes, they can go out, but they might live in apartments, they might live in very urban areas. So what would you suggest for someone to do now? And then we're talking about fall as far as I'm concerned, summer's around the corner always, because I don't particularly like wintertime. But during the nice weather, we're able to go outside. Even if we don't have a garden inside, we can maybe take a look at some beautiful things that are outside. So advice, or what could you suggest?
Yes. Okay, there's quite a lot to cover there. I mean, I think the first thing is that the pandemic has really revealed how much we need nature for our mental health. And that's, as you say, when I wrote the book before, and it's been quite salutary, really, to see so many of the things that I've written about, particularly the research there's been a lot of research in the last few decades into the health benefits of nature and particularly nature connection, and to see our need for that writ large at the start of the pandemic was really striking. That certainly in the UK, and I gather in the US as well, there was a great rush to the garden centres. They could barely keep up with the demand. People were sowing seeds, and seeds seeds have a future written into them. They just give you that sense of something good to look forward to. So at a time when everything was closing down, when there was terrible fear and uncertainty, these simple acts gave people a psychological lifeline. And nature's continued to do that for many people, through, there's been you have to look on social media to see how much people are posting about things they've seen on their walks, or, bird watching, for example, has grown enormously in popularity, as well as gardening. And certainly people who have gardens have been appreciating them much more than ever before. And it's revealed to us how a garden or access to green space really shouldn't be a luxury. It is vital for health that we have that. We evolved, our species evolved in nature, and we are primed in various ways to respond to natural settings, or certain aspects of them, and in particular the amount of greenery that's around us. Research tells us that this lowers our blood pressure, reduces cortisol. So all these things help, and can make a huge difference. And I know this is going out in the fall, and I think the fall is, we're recording this when we don't know quite how bad things will be. So it's difficult, but I think whatever happens, I think it's going to be hard in the fall. And I think what's crucial is to keep up that contact actually with nature in one form or another, whether that's through bringing plants inside the house, house plants, pot plants, growing things on a windowsill. Cut flowers actually can make a huge difference. There have been many studies that show they reduce people's feelings of depression and anxiety. And certainly in hospital patients, having a view of nature, a view of a tree or having a plant reduces stress and anxiety and leads to less need for pain relief. So all these things tell us that these are important things to do. And I still, however bad the weather is, I think it's important to get outside if you can. And when you do get outside, to actually connect with whatever nature there is around you, the trees, if there's any birds, hopefully, one bonus of the autumn might be that the parks are a bit less crowded. So it might be a bit easier to kind of to walk more freely. I don't know. I mean, we don't know what it's going to be like at this stage. And I think it's also worth adding that studies have shown that virtual nature doesn't have quite the same level of benefit, but it can have the same anxiety reducing and mood boosting effects. So we're talking about things like watching videos of nature, listening to birdsong, for instance, listening to running water. All these kind of sensory stimuli are very helpful to us, and the research shows that they help shift us. They help shift the brain to a more relaxed state of being, which involves our alpha waves in the brain, and those in turn are associated with a release of serotonin, the mood boosting neurotransmitter serotonin.
So I want to go back
all
to
those things are kind of reasons to keep up.
I want to go back to one simple thing that you said before. We talked about there are people who either live in apartments or live in areas where there's no little ledge, there's no little something for them to put something out. But you talked about even just a small house plant or taking the seedling of something and something that can grow in a small plant inside, that in itself could help.
Yes, it can, and there are studies that kind of that confirm that. For example, studies in care homes for the elderly that have shown, having a plant to look after and having sort of as much sort of green vegetation sort of in the home, plants and things. I have to say some of them have included pets as well, which are also very, very helpful and very important. But that these have been shown to, again, what I said earlier, with hospital patients, reduce the need for medication, improve mental health, and increase longevity as well. So I think, we can't underestimate the impact of this. It's not, contact with nature can't protect us from suffering. There's no getting away from that, but it can help us manage stress. It seems to have a sort of buffering effect on us, and that can be invaluable when when you're in a situation in which you're helpless and there's not much you can do about your circumstances. This is one thing that you can do.
So I know that in your book you did tell some stories of people that you met during this. What is one of the most uplifting? You talked about the prisoner in Rikers. What about when you were in some of the inner cities? What you describe one of the most uplifting stories? Someone that you met.
Yes, I could talk about Grace, who appears in the book, actually, who had become really pretty much housebound through anxiety and depression and agoraphobia. And as a last resort, she agreed to attend a horticultural project. And she expected to get almost nothing out of it. She'd never gardened. And so she went into it very, very skeptical. But almost immediately she realized that within this setting, you know, I spoke earlier about the safety of the setting, that the peace of the garden, you know, just gave her a feeling of relaxation that she had not had for a very, very long time. At the beginning, you know, the horticultural therapists were, horticultural therapists are very, very good usually at kind of reading what stage people are at and what they're ready to do. And she was just allowed just to be in nature, not to have to garden, not to have to do anything. And she did that for some time. And then began to sort of notice what other people were doing, what the groups were doing together, and decided she wanted to get involved and have a go. And then she began to get into gardening. So I interviewed her after she'd been attending the project for a year, and she just signed up to do a second year. And she said to me, sort of, you know, one thing she described was, it gives me a whole new feeling when I'm here. And you know, her mental health was much, much better. She, at the beginning, when she first started attending, she couldn't walk to the shops on her own along her local street. She needed someone to accompany her, but she was able to do that by the end. And on top of that, she just began to experience a sort of a feeling of joy actually in life, little glimpses of it, and a real feeling of satisfaction. But also, what she also found, and I think this is a very important effect as well, you know, she only attended the project one morning a week, but actually what she found after a few months was, when she was at home, if she began to get anxious, she could think herself back into the garden. So she'd internalize this space, and just imagining herself in the garden helped calm her anxiety.
That's a great story. So gardening, so if you had one message in just a few words to leave with everyone, what would that be?
I think it's actually something that, well, it's something I mentioned a bit earlier about, if you're walking, let's say you haven't got a garden, if you're walking out in nature, you know, don't just plug your headphones in and zone out, and, you know, spend at least some of the time, you know, really connecting with what's around you, you know, allowing your senses to sort of perceive, you know, whether that's the clouds in the sky or the light on the leaves in the trees. Just allow yourself to connect with it. And that's, you know, we're talking about mindfulness really, but mindfulness in nature seems to be it's a very powerful form of mindfulness. And I would say the same to people who garden, because I think, you know, sometimes it's something that happened to me actually at a certain stage in my gardening, and I had to learn it, was just to slow down. Sometimes I could get so caught up, because I had a busy working life as well, but I could get so caught up in the jobs that needed doing, you know, and I would go around sort of, you know, noticing the weeds, and you know, so just always being in kind of doing mode, getting tasks, you know, getting things done, and actually just having those moments when you just don't do anything. You either walk through the garden or just allow yourself to sit and really take it in, is enormously important.
Well, so this has been great. I love the fact that it doesn't have to be anything huge, that people can actually get something out of this just by having even just a little plant, or opening up their mind and eyes to what's around.
Yeah.
So where can people find more information about you? What is your website?
I have a website. It's just my name, SueStuartSmith.com. And I'm at Sue Stuart Smith on Twitter and Instagram. So people can find me there.
Well, so the Well Garden Mind, it does have restorative mental health benefits. It's fantastic. I thank you so much for being with me today. This has been very, very informative and delightful.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me, Sylvia.
My pleasure. You can find us on all of your popular podcast platforms. And of course, our website, sylviame.com. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay tuned.